In December 2025, sitting down for a rare, candid interview on the Katie Miller podcast, the CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and X, the man who arguably runs more world-changing companies than anyone alive, was asked a simple question: would you do Doge again? And without hesitation, he said, no. Now, think about that for a second. This is someone who launched rockets, built electric cars when everyone said it was impossible, and bought one of the most influential social media platforms on Earth. And yet, one of his biggest reflections, one of his clearest regrets, is a chapter that most of the world watched unfold in real time. So today, we're not here to debate politics. We're here to understand the thinking behind that answer and what it reveals about one of the most unconventional minds in modern business. Welcome back to Rich Principle, the channel where we break down the mindsets, mental models, and decision-making frameworks of the world's most successful people. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. We put out this kind of deep dive content every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's get into Elon Musk. On December 9th, 2025, Musk sat down with Katie Miller, a former Doge spokesperson who now hosts her own podcast, for a nearly 1-hour conversation that went viral almost immediately, racking up millions of views on X. The interview spanned topics from government efficiency to AI nightmares, from simulation theory to cheeseburgers. But underneath all of it, there were some genuinely fascinating windows into how this man thinks, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. Let's start with the Doge chapter, because it tells us something really important about how high performers evaluate decisions. When Katie asked Musk what his very first thought was when he found himself in the Roosevelt Room on January 20th, 2025, about to take on the role of leading the Department of Government Efficiency, he said, and this is almost word for word, "I couldn't believe I was there. It all seemed extremely surreal." Now, here's where it gets interesting. Doge wasn't even a real government department. Musk described it as a made-up name, literally coined by internet suggestions just 2 or 3 months before launch. He was going to call it the Government Efficiency Commission. Someone online said, no, call it the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, and that stuck. Think about that framing for a second. The most talked about government initiative of 2025 started as a crowdsourced internet joke, and Musk ran with it. Now, did it work? Here's his honest assessment. We were somewhat successful, not wildly successful, not a revolution, somewhat. He pointed to what he called zombie payments, government payouts that were going out with no clear code or explanation attached. His estimate, roughly $100 to $200 billion per year in payments that, as he put it, really should not be going out. Simply by requiring a payment code and explanation before funds could be released, Doge was able to target and interrupt a portion of that waste. Sounds straightforward, right? Except, and this is the part most people miss, it wasn't, Musk put it this way, it's a pretty rare individual who would ask the government to stop sending them money. When you try to shut off the flow of funds, especially funds tied to political interests, the reaction is fierce, immediate, personal. And in Musk's case, it showed up as vandalism at Tesla dealerships, boycotts against his companies, and what he described as sustained attacks on his business reputation. This is what economists call opportunity cost. Every hour Musk spent in Washington was an hour not spent on SpaceX, on Tesla, on XAI. And the blowback from Doge didn't just cost him time, it actively damaged the companies he'd spent decades building. So when he says, I would have worked on my companies and they wouldn't have been burning the cars, that's not a small statement. That's a founder doing a hard, honest cost-benefit analysis on one of the biggest decisions of his life. Now this is important. He's not saying Doge was wrong. He's saying the cost was higher than he anticipated. And that recalibration, that's actually a sign of intellectual honesty. Most people, especially public figures, don't admit things like this. Musk did. Here's where things get really interesting. When Katie asked Musk what keeps him up at night, he paused and then said AI. Not competitors, not regulators, not even the challenges of landing rockets or building humanoid robots. The thing that gives him nightmares, literally, is artificial intelligence. He said, I've had many AI nightmares, many days in a row. Now, and here's the nuance. Musk is also one of the biggest investors in AI through his company xAI and the Grok platform. So you might ask, why build something that terrifies you? His answer to that question is one of the most intellectually honest things I've heard from any tech executive. He said, essentially, what I predict will happen is not the same as what I want to happen. Let me say that again. What I predict is not what I want. He believes the trajectory of AI and robotics is essentially unstoppable at this point. Regardless of whether he participates or not, AI will continue advancing at a rapid pace. So his reasoning is, if it's going to happen either way, it's better to be at the table trying to steer it responsibly than to step back and hope someone else does. This is a mental model called calculated participation under uncertainty. You don't have to be optimistic about an outcome to decide that engagement is your best response to it. He also said something striking about work in the future. His prediction, not his wish, his prediction is that AI and robotics will eventually be able to produce all the goods and services anyone could want. Work will become optional. And when Katie pressed him on what people would do with all that free time, he simply said, whatever they want. That's a profound shift in how we think about human purpose. And it's coming from someone who's actively building it. If this kind of deep dive thinking is useful to you, smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who think like you. All right, let's zoom out, way out. One of the most revealing parts of this interview had nothing to do with politics or business. It had to do with how Musk thinks about time. Not quarterly earnings time, not even decade-long time, but civilizational, evolutionary time. He talked about Starship, SpaceX's most ambitious rocket, and described it as one of the most profound technologies in human history. Here's why. Every rocket ever built before Starship was, at some level, expendable. Even partially reusable systems had meaningful limitations. Starship, according to Musk, is the first design where full and rapid reusability is a realistic outcome. Why does that matter? Because without reusability, going to Mars isn't economically viable, period. And Musk places the project of making life multiplanetary in what he calls the Evolutionary Hall of Fame, somewhere alongside single-cell life, multicellular organisms, and life moving from ocean to land. In his view, if historians exist thousands of years from now, they will look back at Starship the way we look back at pivotal moments in the history of life itself. Now, you might think that's a bit dramatic, but here's the reasoning underneath it. Musk isn't pitching Mars as a luxury destination or a billionaire's escape hatch. He's explicit about this. He says Mars will be dangerous, the food won't be as good, it'll be cramped, you might die. That's the sales pitch. Why would anyone go? He draws a direct parallel to early settlers going to the Americas. People knew it was dangerous, many didn't survive. But they went anyway because the alternative was staying put in a world where survival wasn't guaranteed either. His core argument is simple, planetary redundancy. If everything Earth has is concentrated on one planet, then one catastrophic event, asteroid, pandemic, nuclear war, climate disaster, ends the entire story of human civilization. Mars isn't about escaping Earth. It's about backing up consciousness itself. That is a completely different mental frame than how most people think about business, ambition, or even legacy. Let's bring this back to Earth, literally, and look at some of Musk's personal operating principles. When asked about irrational fears, his answer was fascinating. He said, I try not to have irrational fears. If I find one, I squelch it. His reasoning, fear is a distraction. He referenced the idea that fear is the mind killer, a concept he clearly takes seriously in his daily decision making. Now, that doesn't mean he feels no fear. He has AI nightmares. He clearly felt the weight of what happened during Doge. But there's a difference between acknowledging a real risk and letting irrational anxiety govern your decisions. He makes that distinction deliberately. On sleep, he gets about 6 hours a night. He actually timed it with a phone app, 5 hours, 56 minutes. He tried sleeping less, but found his cognitive performance dropped enough to make it not worth it. This is interesting because there's a common myth, especially in startup culture, that sleeping less is a badge of honor. Musk is essentially saying, no, there's a cognitive floor, and I'm not going to pretend that crossing it helps me. On his daily structure, he talks about minimizing context switching, moving between Tesla, SpaceX, XAI, and everything else. He says the cognitive penalty for switching context every few seconds is enormous. So he tries to segment his days, batching similar kinds of thinking together. This is a principle that researchers in cognitive psychology call deep work. The idea that focused, uninterrupted attention produces dramatically better results than fragmented multitasking. Here's what most people miss. Managing a mind like Musk's isn't about working harder. It's about structuring attention. The bottleneck isn't time. It's cognitive bandwidth. Which of these mental models are you going to apply this week? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Okay, this is where Musk's thinking gets genuinely philosophical, and honestly, pretty fascinating. Musk has a theory about predicting the future. His idea is this: the most interesting outcome is the most likely outcome. Now, how does he get there? Through simulation theory. His reasoning is roughly this: if there are civilizations advanced enough to run simulations of reality, which our own current AI suggests is increasingly plausible, then those civilizations would only continue running a simulation as long as it remained interesting. The moment it becomes boring or predictable, they stop it. Like canceling a TV show with bad ratings. Therefore, if we are in a simulation, the outcomes that survive are the ones that stay engaging. Drama, stakes, reversals, the classic story arc. He even applies this to recent history, noting that a political comeback story that involves an initial rise, a dramatic fall, and a triumphant return is more interesting, and therefore, in his model, more likely than a story that just runs in a straight line. You can agree or disagree with the premise, but the underlying intellectual move is worth noticing. He's using a speculative framework not to escape reality, but to make predictions about it. That's an unusual way to use philosophy, not as consolation, but as a forecasting tool. His conclusion: we have one goal, keep it interesting. And by that he means, don't let the story end in catastrophe or boredom. Engage, build, push forward. Because, a civilization that gives up is a simulation that gets turned off. Whether you take that literally or metaphorically, it's a genuinely energizing way to frame human purpose. If this episode made you think differently about decision-making or long-term thinking, the like button means everything to a channel like this. Thank you, seriously. So, what do we actually take away from all of this? Elon Musk is a deeply complicated, sometimes contradictory figure, but when you strip away the headlines and look at how he actually thinks, a few consistent principles emerge. One, he's willing to do honest postmortems on his own decisions, even very public ones. That level of intellectual honesty is rare. Two, he distinguishes sharply between what he predicts and what he wants. Most people collapse those two things. Musk keeps them separate, and it makes his analysis much more clear-eyed. Three, he thinks on timescales that most people find uncomfortable: civilizational, evolutionary, multi-generational. And that long frame shapes every decision at the shorter scale. And four, he manages his own cognitive resources, deliberately limiting context switching, protecting sleep, squelching irrational fear, because he understands that the quality of his thinking is the actual constraint, not his hours. These aren't just interesting facts about one man. They're frameworks you can actually use. So here's my question for you. Which of those four principles are you already applying, and which one do you need to work on most? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. The most interesting people in the world aren't the ones who avoid hard decisions. They're the ones who make them clearly, learn from them honestly, and keep building anyway. That's the rich principle, and that's a wrap for today. If you're new here, subscribe. If you've been here for a while, you already know the drill. See you in the next one.